Hi, I'm Sean Stone. Prepare for the Mind War here on Buzzsaw.
Central Intelligence Agency.
It was described by witnesses as...
For those of you who are not familiar with the name Lieutenant Colonel Michael.A.Aquino, he was the founder of the Temple of Set and spent many years in the U.S. Army as Lieutenant Colonel. He's the author of books such as MindWar, the Temple of Set, and the Church of Satan, and he'll be discussing his career and also philosophy here on the show. Michael, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here, Sean.
I just want to start out, I think, by clarifying and understanding the nature of what it is to be a Setian. Obviously, slightly different from a Satanist, but obviously you did spend some time with the Church of Satan under LaVey initially. And just to understand what is the mindset, what is the philosophy of a Setian? What is that worldview like?
The Temple of Set was originally thought to take the context of what our original Satanic experience had been out of the Judeo-Christian mythology system. And harking back to the original Church of Satan days, we were looking really to find the nature of what is generally called the human soul. In other words, what it is within us that animates us, that gives us freedom of decision, of conceptualization, the intellectual life force. The Church of Satan, of course, had a certain social criticism aspect to it, and it also liked to hold Judeo-Christianity's feet to the fire. After 10 years, both of those became sort of played out, and we were looking, as Obi-Wan Kenobi suggested to Luke Skywalker in the first Star Wars movie, to take a first step into a larger universe. So the Temple of Set exists to explore the self, the personality, and we do this through the media of ancient Egyptian religion, which we found to be the most sophisticated. So what you see in the Temple of Set is not anything with an agenda towards good or evil per se, but rather towards understanding consciousness, and once you understand consciousness, to maximize your personal use of it in such a way that you are not the slave to conventions or to propaganda of any sort, for that matter, so that you are in effect a God yourself, responsible for your own decisions concerning matters of good or evil or morality.
So, in the context of the prominence of mind, basically, there's the philosophy that all the universe is mental, right? It is a mental reality that we live in. It's mind that really dictates the reality we create. Would you say that, for example, during rituals that are conducted, that there are actually any entities, spirits, daemons, as they're called, that are actually invoked, or are they simply manifestations of one's own mind?
Well, as we understand the universes, there are actually two of them, what we call the objective universe, which would be the physical universe of matter, mass, and energy that we normally think of as our external natural environment. And then there is also each individual's subjective universe, which is the perception, the interpretation, and the expressions and impressions that you yourself both project into the objective universe and take in from it. So we actually operate in both of these contexts. What we call lesser black magic would consist of operations within the objective universe using little known or little understood laws to influence events and behavior and perceptions. And what we call greater black magic is probably more what you're thinking of in terms of ritual or ceremonial magic, which has to do with looking into yourself to explore and refine your own concept of yourself and your soul. Now, the question of, are there demons or are there entities sort of like you'd see in a horror movie? Well, no, not in the way that most people would think, but we view the consciousness as a particularization of a universal principle, which is what we refer to as Set, which is the source of all individual consciousnesses, a little bit like in the Platonic concept of forms or first principles. So what you're doing really in a ritual is activating your personal perceptions and your interpretations of these things to refine that image, to make it into something useful for you yourself.
But again, in your understanding, then you would say that there are no external entities that are conjured in these rituals that are external to you?
Well, that's true in the case of a greater black magical ritual when it is essentially between you and the source of your consciousness being set. If it is an operation of lesser black magic out in the material universe, then we understand and interact with what we refer to as the Neteru, the precise name in hieroglyphic for the Egyptian gods, which are the principles that govern the objective universe. They would be collectively referred to as natural law. So when we are attempting operations in the objective universe, then yes, you might say that we are invoking, if you'd like to use that term, various...
I'm sorry, what was the last word you said? Various? The last thing you said was various, you're invoking various Neteru?
Yes.
Yeah.
As applicable to a particular situation that we would like to influence.
So there has been a long allegation that the British Empire, essentially under John Dee, right, the first so-called chief sorcerer of the British Empire, 007, began invoking and doing deals with some of these lesser entities, let's say, or lesser black magic relationships with Neteru, for example, and under these deals, and basically the British Empire was allowed to have tremendous power over the material world. And then apparently America sort of inherited those relationships, many of which are predicated on blood sacrifices or some type of ritual dealings that allow America to basically maintain the Anglo-American empire as it now stands. Does that make sense to you, or do you have any insight into that?
No, John Dee was an astrologer and essentially the court magician for Queen Elizabeth I. And he was primarily an astrologer, but he also dabbled in what you'd call ceremonial magic, invoking angels, his pet one being a nice young lady angel named Madimi. And from these, he wrote down what are generally referred to as the Enochian keys or Enochian calls, which are a series of angelic statements, basically referring to different levels of the human consciousness again. But none of this was particularly conspiratorial. The closest that he came to being a conspirator was that Queen Elizabeth did send him abroad to places like Poland, and according to at least one of the historians who documented his life, Richard Deacon, he served indeed very much as a sort of clandestine special agent for Queen Elizabeth, sending her coded messages in the form of astrological statements at that time. But this did not really change the course of direction of the British Empire that was purely materialistic, with which Dee had nothing to do.
But not simply Dee, I'm saying beyond that, has America in any sense inherited some of these dealings with the Neteru? I mean, it seems that the point, if you're going to be practicing ritual magic and it exists, then people in power would also be performing the same rituals for purposes of maintaining that power, right? The so-called Illuminati have been practicing this apparently for thousands of years. My question is, why would, what we're seeing today in terms of America's projection of power across the world, do you see that in any way as a reflection of dealings that were taking place or done in a magical ritual setting?
Once again, no. The United States was really the result of the thought of John Locke as expressed through persons like Thomas Jefferson, which was a very materialistic period in history. And we were one of the first countries to try to implement a social contract version of very materialistic decision-making, so that despite the strange notion that the United States has mottos such as under God and so on, it was actually a very atheistic country when it was created, and has remained so ever since, because its decision-making is all argumentative and really not subject to any kind of supernatural influence. The closest, I suppose, that conspiracy theorists might come to that in actual history would be the fact that many of the founding fathers were Masons. But this was not something, I think, that really influenced policy making or policy decisions. We've actually been a very pragmatic nation that way. We make decisions on things like money and power, I suppose, and influence, but really not to curry the favor of any supernatural influence.
So you don't see any supernatural influence at play, let's say, in the projection of American power?
No, I don't. I would interpret it more as a function of economics, politics, in a very materialistic sense. I mean, this is an imperial atmosphere that we live in today, in which the warp and woof of it is who controls assets, money, in resources, that sort of thing.
But if you yourself, someone like yourself, could, for example, do a lesser working in magic and commune with the so-called Neteru or some kind of entities, why can't those in higher positions of power do the same thing?
Well, they could if they were interested and knew what they were doing. And in fact, in an amusing sort of way, MindWar, the book that I've recently authored, is a sort of a Boy Scout handbook telling them how to do exactly that. But it does so from the standpoint of saying that human decision-making is out of control in a very negative way, and this book and the procedures in it are a manual to bring it back into control in a very positive way, so that we don't just run around the world killing people and blowing up stuff.
Right. And so what is the procedure for MindWar that you think would be more positive? Because oftentimes, we know that the MK Ultra programs have existed. We know that various forms of brainwashing and mind control have been looked into, certainly by the CIA and whatnot. Army intelligence, for example, I'm sure knows a lot of techniques for that purpose. So how do you distinguish between MindWar as a positive as opposed to an attempt to brainwash and manipulate people?
Well, first, I've been involved in intelligence and psychological operations for about 40 years in all levels of it and across the intelligence community. So I've seen and studied, what's been done, and quite frankly, most of it has been useless and pointless and counterproductive and destructive. So the reason that I researched and wrote MindWar was to take things away from that haphazardness and bring some sanity to it. What happens normally in the process of resolving international conflict is that you have arguments that take place, they can be casual and they can be diplomatic, but people argue a problem with each other, and then if that argument fails and no compromise or solution is reached, then they stop arguing, they stop discussing, pick up guns, bombs, and weapons and start shooting each other. A pretty good historical example of this would be the American Civil War, where there was a lot of argument and a lot of attempted compromise before 1860. And then when this all failed and fell apart, people stopped trying to argue or intellectually come up with a solution, picked up guns, and started slaughtering one another for 5 years, which at the end of it really didn't accomplish a whole lot except to kill an enormous amount of people and come up with a very unstable sort of peace after that, including a freeing of the slaves that we're still having trouble actualizing today. So when I started researching MindWar, what I wanted to look at is exactly how does human thought function. And this in the book is under the heading of the architecture of thought. And most people know almost nothing about this. You will not have heard this really from anyone else because it's something that we've gone into in extreme depth in PSYOP research. Now, the part of your mind that makes, that draws logical conclusions and that reasons and that discusses things with other people is the algorithmic part, and it is conscious thinking, and it takes place in about 5% of your thought process. The other 95% takes place in your subconscious and is referred to academically as pattern thinking. These are these large overlays of reality and perceived truth that you refer to without thinking about them, that tell you whether your thoughts are valid or not. And a lot of the ways that these patterns come into existence are mechanical through your senses and your sensory perceptions that you're not aware of. For example, we're all familiar with the various brain frequencies, the alpha, the beta, the delta, and the theta. Well, alpha puts you in a pleasant mood, theta puts you in a creative mood, beta puts you in a somewhat nervous and confrontational mood. So if you would like a room full of people to be in a fairly good mood and cooperative towards resolving a problem, first you sweep the room to make sure there's no beta in it, and then secondly, you blanket it with alpha. That's just one example. Color perception. Most people think of colors as something that you choose. Well, I like this color or I like that color. Actually, at the subconscious level, colors have a very strong impact on the human constitution that most people aren't aware of. The color red makes us nervous, brittle, antagonistic. The color blue makes us thoughtful and creative. The color green makes us somewhat passive. This, again, is at the sort of eye chemistry level. We're not talking about preferences here or situations where you might have a particular passion for this or that color. So by constructing these, by presenting certain colors along with certain brain waves and so on, and several other different situations here, you can actually construct, excuse me for just a minute here. Oh, sorry about that.
No problem. So based on the color patterning, you can
Yes.
create a
And
certain
actually,
mood, a certain response.
Yes, you can create a more cooperative atmosphere, which is what you're trying to do. So the entire thrust of the MindWar book and all of what I call the psychons or psychological control systems in it are basically to explain the influences from the objective universe, from the physical universe, that come into your body all the time and influence your perception of reality at the subconscious level. And to take all of these essentially and push them in the direction of intelligence and positive thinking and cooperation. This sounds almost like science fiction, but it's actually quite scientific and quite handleable by various devices that you can use. So what you were referring to a few minutes ago as some of the ways in which, say, the CIA, for example, blundered around with MKUltra, were completely misguided in this sense, because they were trying to use things like chemistry, sensory deprivation, and stress to bludgeon people into some sort of passive cooperation at that 5% of argumentative level. And all it accomplished, all those programs ever did, was to scramble people's thinking and to frighten them. And that that gets you nowhere in terms of problem solving, and it actually gets you nowhere in terms of intelligence acquisition, because then you're just dealing with people who are frightened or hurt or psychotic in some way. So those basically were a huge waste of time. And I wrote a paper some years back about one of them that followed up MKUltra, called Project Stargate, in which I subtitled it $20 million up in smoke and mirrors, which is what it amounted to. So what MindWar is all about is not touching that 5% of argumentative or algorithmic thinking at all. All it's intended to do is to put the most positive atmosphere towards the 95% of our pattern thinking that gives us a disposition as to how we wish to interact with other people and to cooperate with them. Because if you can get that kind of a cooperative and positive problem-solving atmosphere, then the 5% is peanuts. It's chicken feed. It'll work itself out. MindWar also operates on the notion that, yes, you can conduct war, because war is what happens when diplomacy breaks down. But MindWar does not envision war as people against people. MindWar takes both sides of people and joins them together against the other side, which is the mutual problem. So MindWar is actually war by all the people involved against the common problem, which is what you might call the enemy. So it's a sort of a new way of looking at war, and it's a way in which nobody gets hurt.
But who is the enemy? I mean, for example, from the position of those in power, the enemy is their own people. I mean, for example, right, the idea of divide and conquer, you have to maintain your own positions of power. So where is the agreed upon enemy? That's the hard thing to reconcile, is the fact that peace is not necessarily profitable for the military-industrial side of things. There is peacetime industry, but right now we have a very entrenched military-industrial complex, which you saw, through your career, which doesn't have really an interest in peace. They prefer the war on terror being endless, trillions of dollars spent against perhaps a small terrorist threat, right? In reality, probably maybe a few thousand people. And yet how many trillions of dollars have been spent, how much destruction is created in the wake of it, just goes to show that the real interest from the point of view of power is war.
Well, I agree with you to the standpoint that there is an enormous amount of destructive motivation right now. That, again, is one of the things that prompted me to do this study and to write this proposal up as a book. And indeed, right now, this book is circulating throughout the major areas of the U.S. government, in addition to being commercially available. But the book begins by acknowledging that, yes, the world is in a very unstable and very catastrophic situation right now. That's one of the things that makes this important, because if you look at the situation right now internationally, it's simply not sustainable. There is too much damage, there is too much destruction, there is too much horror really going on around the planet, and this can't go on without everything breaking down. So one way or the other, we have to address it in a positive way. Even within what you might call the military-industrial complex, the scrabble for resources and the scrabble for profits is becoming more and more of an end game, you might say, because we are running out of resources. We are running out of ways to control how the world uses and can be sold these resources. So things simply can't go on the way they've been going. It's too dangerous. We have an upsurge, even within the military, of a problem of suicides. And you have a political system today that generally throws its hands up and doesn't know what to do, because people get polarized. Look at what we have right now between the presidency and the Congress, with neither side being able to do anything anymore because they're simply at poles apart and nobody's interested in cooperating. So we've got to get people liking one another and working together. And what MindWar is suggesting is that a great deal of the factors which influence people to be this way are at the mechanical level, at the subconscious level, and can be controlled through technology, which is what the book is talking about. The danger of this, of course, is that these same technological controls could be used to control people in a negative way, to make them more antagonistic, which would lead you to an atmosphere something like Orwell's 1984. So I am taking a big leap of faith here that, as Plato contemplated, the underlying impulse of humanity is to the good and not to the bad. And all through this book, I am pushing that and pushing the morality that we have to look to the common good when we are bringing these functions into focus and using these techniques. That is why this becomes an important thing. And incidentally, as I say in there too, as far as the machinery of profit is concerned, take as an example what we're doing right now with nuclear weapons. There's a big industry to build nuclear weapons, but not to use them, because they're too dangerous and they're too deadly. So the profits are being made, the bombs are stacking up, the missiles are sitting there in the silos, but nobody is being killed by these things. Now, that isn't a very good state of affairs, but it's better than people actually being killed by these. What I'm suggesting is that the levels of conventional weaponry, including things like drones and so on, have reached a similar danger point, and that therefore, if the industry wishes to keep on building these things, go ahead, build them, put them in parades, put them on show, use them to rattle sabers with, but do not use them to kill other people with. You don't need to do that to solve these problems internationally. MindWar will do that for you. Just keep these things around like you do the guided missiles for show until you've matured enough so that you don't feel you have to build them anymore. And instead of building those, you can go out and build some solar panels or windmills.
Well, it seems that your MindWar book comes from many years of research and direct experience, right, with the human mind.
Yes.
Having seen firsthand, for example, weren't you involved with the so-called the Jedi Knights concept in the 80s, when there was a notion of trying to create more, I don't even know what you say, more holistic soldiers in a sense, right? Who have a psychic ability as well as physical abilities, right? The whole super soldier concept.
Yes, one of my good friends, Colonel John Alexander, who was involved in what was then called Project Jedi, which was the subject of a recent movie called The Men Who Stare at Goats, was, of course, involved in that process. But I would say that compared to what's in the MindWar book and in the MindWar program, again, it was operating pretty ignorantly. It really didn't go into the architecture of how a human subconsciousness is constructed, or all the natural forces and systems that go into constructing it. It was a sort of touchy-feely sort of thing. I would put it on the scale of maybe 1 out of 10, where the sophistication of MindWar is concerned.
But it also seems that the most effective MindWar actually occurs on the human child, right? Before the age of 7, for example. That's when we say that we reach the age of reason at the age of 7. So wouldn't it seem that the most effective way of, for example, influencing humanity is to affect the children?
I don't think so. At least my research never took me in any direction like that, because the patterns that we're talking about here, these subconscious patterns, are all the ones that are developed by the time that you're a functioning adult. Usually when you're a child, you're, I would say, pretty much an emotional bundle, and you don't really have what I'd call fully developed subconscious patterns in this way. And of course, your reasoning and your argumentative thinking is what education is designed to give you throughout your schooling process and your socialization process. But what we're talking about in MindWar are the fully developed subconscious pattern thinking sets that adults have when they are exactly in a position to do good or bad influences to one another. And again, the argumentative part of this, what we call algorithmic thinking, which is the 5% of thinking that's not the pattern thinking, That takes place at the conscious level, and that again is an adult function. So MindWar is completely and wholly oriented towards dealing with these things at the functional adult level, which of course is also where international problems and situations occur and the damage decisions are taking place. Children are just the victims of this system and really are not involved in it.
Yeah, well, were you ever familiar with the Monarch project or so-called Monarch sub-project of MKUltra?
Well, the Monarch program, as far as I'm concerned, is nothing more than an urban myth. The MKUltra program was very real, and that was a program by the Central Intelligence Agency that was actually a carryover from some previous ones that they were experimenting with. And there were actually some carryover programs from MKUltra that went over into the Defense Department. But none of those, in my experience or any of my research, had anything to do with trying to do something to or with children.
Right.
The concept of Project Monarch, I think, is a complete fiction.
So you never saw any of the PSYOP programs or whether CIA, Defense Department, that were investigating or experimenting with children?
That is absolutely correct. And I know that if anything like that had happened in the Defense Department, that I or any other officer of what I would call proper integrity would hear about or know about, we would object to it immediately and formally and very aggressively. And I rather think that from the people that I've known in the intelligence community, and this is sort of difficult to say in this era that we've just been through, where you've seen the CIA involved in torture programs and so on, but all of the people that I was involved with in the intelligence community generally had a very serious approach towards their own ethical responsibilities. And while they were not adverse to playing tag-you-it with the Russians now and then, they were not evil or destructive or sadistic people.
But my question is, from a Setian point of view, if the idea of the ultimate goal being to realize one's own godhood, right? Aren't you beyond good and evil at that point, or is there still a moral standard or code? You see.
Well, the more that you become responsible for yourself, then the more you assert the responsibility to go beyond dictated conventions of good and evil. In other words, your community, your family, the society around you, perhaps your religion, if it's a conventional religion, all give you laws of behavior and guidelines of behavior and said, if you do this, it's good. If you do this, it's bad. Well, we find as we go through life that a lot of these laws are imperfect and they're approximations, and that there's a difference between doing the moral good and perceiving it and doing the legal good, as it were, at any point in time. So the challenge is, as you become more and more sophisticated, you have to take more responsibility for seeking the true good, what Plato referred to as the agathon, the pinnacle of abstract good in any particular situation, which you can't simply excuse by saying, well, this is legal and this is illegal. So as we move more into the direction of self-deification, you also assume that same responsibility of a God, if you use that term, to recognize the goods and the evils in a particular situation, and also, of course, to choose the good.
You mentioned MKUltra earlier, and one of the interesting aspects of that, I'm not sure if you heard about this, was so-called Collins elite, who supposedly had come together because they had seen during the MKUltra experiments that some supernatural activity would sometimes occur because of the nature of the mind and how the MKUltra experiments basically were activating people's minds. Sometimes, for example, it was creating, I guess, what you called portals or some kind of interdimensional appearances of UFOs or sightings like this. And they started investigating and trying to see, for example, could there be a relationship between our mental phenomena and and then the sightings of UFOs in the modern era, right? Post 47 in particular. Did you ever? How would you say? Have you heard about this group or this aspect of MK Ultra?
No, and quite frankly, again, from I've made quite a study of MK Ultra and the other government experiments there in preparation for my research towards the MindWar concept. And again, MindWar was a mess from start to finish. It was an attempt to drug or to stress out the conscious parts of the human mind to sort of try to create a Manchurian candidate, kind of a mind slave or dupe like that. And all this was a total failure, and they should have known it from the beginning if they had looked into thought architecture to understand, as I said, how the human brain actually functions, which, for their pains, they simply did not. And the notion that you could use, say, a psychedelic drug of some sort, like LSD, to go through some sort of portal and see gods, well, yes, I mean, you can create hallucinations. There was a pretty good example of this in the book and the movie Altered States, in which the combined use of sensory deprivation tank and Mexican mushrooms.
But that's not what I mean. I mean, think about Aleister Crowley, for example. I mean, Crowley saw, what was it, Lamb, who looked kind of like a gray alien when he was doing rituals.
Well, I don't remember Lamb per se. Crowley's holy guardian angel was Aiwass, but that was his higher self-visualization. And Crowley himself, of course, was a mixture of some very interesting concepts in what we would call greater black magic, but he also indulged himself very actively in the use of drugs. So much of the results that you get from reading Crowley's biographies, all of which I have read in his autobiography, The Confessions, and his own magical records, which I've studied in their original forms and manuscripts, are not of much use because basically, again, you're dealing with scrambled thought processes here. MindWar does not involve any kind of scrambling of the human thought processes at all. It can't. It needs to keep everything under control, and it needs to keep the conscious mind completely conscious so that when you have a personality that is maximized for its intelligence and its creativity and its cooperativeness, that you can bring that active decision-making function of the brain to bear on the problem. You don't do that by scrambling people's brains or by hallucinating them.
Right. I'm simply trying to understand your belief about the multidimensional nature of this reality. I mean, I know, for example, Colonel John Alexander dismisses the idea of UFOs. Do you also dismiss UFOs as I don't know, as a hoax or as a drug-induced hallucination, or do you think that there are actually these ships manifesting into our reality because, again, we are in some kind of multidimensional universe?
Well, I think that the objective universe, as we refer to it, the external material one, is not multidimensional as people understand it. It's one universe. It's there of matter, mass, and energy. It does have some strange aspects to it, such as zero-point energy and, of course, a certain amount of antimatter in it, which is sort of an inverted kind of presence in this universe. But these sort of fantasy or science fiction notions that you sometimes come up with as multi-dimensional universes where you can step from one to the other, a little bit like an H.P. Lovecraft story. No, I think that's great fun for science fiction and fantasy writers, but it's not the reality. What you do have within your own subjective consciousness is the ability to construct, if you like, as many universes as you wish under your own personal control. And this, at its lightest weight, you might say, would be something like daydreaming or just normal dreaming. But you can do this consciously, and you can do it through control of your senses, such as John Lilly did with separate sensory deprivation tank experiments and so on. Where UFOs are concerned, Colonel Alexander actually does believe in the real existence of UFOs. He's written a very good book on the subject. He, as I said, was involved in a number of what you might call the stranger projects within the Defense Department, and that gave him access to a number of people in the intelligence community. And when he decided to write this book, he basically made the rounds, spoke to various generals and various high-level people within the intelligence agencies and said, okay, how about this? And he got very straight answers from them at an unclassified level, bearing in mind that he did not have what you call in the business a need to know concerning classified information that has to do with space intelligence. So he wrote his book based on the most straightforward answers that he could get at an unclassified level from the people at the top levels of these agencies, which is why it's a very good book. And he's a very hard-nosed person. You're not talking about a kook here. You're talking about somebody who makes very sound decisions on very good data. So I recommend his book without hesitation. Now, one of the differences between us here is that I do happen to have a background in space intelligence. I was one of the Army's very first space intelligence officers when they created that specialty in 1990. I went through the Army Space Institute and became an Army Space Intelligence officer, and through the Joint Space Intelligence Program of the U.S. Air Force at that time. And from 1990 to 1994, I was assigned as an intelligence officer with headquarters U.S. Space Command in Colorado Springs, working also at such places as Cheyenne Mountain with the NORAD headquarters there, and even some fun places like Area 51. So I have a slightly different perspective on this from the standpoint of what I was exposed to and what I know. Unfortunately, at the compartmented above top secret levels at which I was cleared, much of this is also stuff that I can't talk about unless I wish to disappear.
Wow.
So I can tell you a few things that will help this a bit. At NORAD, at Cheyenne Mountain, basically we use satellite and other means to scan the entire sky, because the entire mission of NORAD to begin with, that's the North American Air Defense Command, which is a joint US and Canadian command, was originally constructed to keep an eye out for any incoming Soviet ICBMs. But over the years, it generally became an expanded mission to keep an eye out for anything up there. And let me tell you that if you want to know, are there UFOs, I would say there's an enormous amount of them. But a lot of this stuff is things like space junk from past launches and incoming meteors and other stuff that's just sort of out there in space and that comes near the Earth's atmosphere and either burns up in it or sort of bounces off it. So there is an enormous amount of UFO activity there that we see from Space Command that we don't identify. And a lot of it is traveling very fast and very irregularly. And so, yes, if you were to look at it in that sense, there is an enormous amount of unidentified flying object activity out there in space. But I think that what you're sort of zeroing in on is, are there flying saucers that come down and suck up Farmer Jones's cow or bring his wife up to the spaceship for medical experiments? And there I would have to say, no, we haven't seen that kind of thing in a way that you can actually document it. Now,
Well, I think there have been a lot of sightings of more controlled UFO craft by Air Force pilots or professional pilots. They had recently the citizens hearing on disclosure in D.C. with about 40 witnesses testifying before former Congress people. So it's not. I'm not saying it's not between space debris and getting abducted, but there do seem to be very cogent people having sightings of some kind of manned, controlled craft.
Yes, well, here you were getting kind of towards the Area 51 side of things, and I have to sort of be a little careful what I say here. But let me just say that there continues to be a great deal of activity in what's called black programs.
Yeah.
And these are experimental aircraft that are entirely human originated. As to where some of their technology comes from, I really can't go into, but...
Reverse engineering.
Yes. Well, yes, don't quote me on that, but you can use your own speculation on that.
Well, certainly a lot of it seems to have come from Nazi Germany.
Well, yes. Originally, some of it did, and that's a minor and rather funny story in itself, because the Luftwaffe, the Air Force in the Nazi period, was of course trying to research various ways to build longer range bombers and aircraft that they could do things like get to New York with. Good for us, they never quite made that before the end of the war, but they were working on different kinds of propulsion systems that would give them a longer range and not use so much fuel. And that's where the business of some of their circular aircraft concept studies came into existence, because they were looking for ways not to reverse or eliminate the force of gravity. But if you remember from World War I, the Germans were very much into things like Zeppelins, where you could go a long way with a little gasoline because you had a lighter than air aircraft. So by the time we got into the Nazi period and the World War II period, they were looking at ways to compensate for gravity by things like very high-speed counter-rotational devices, a little bit like a gyroscope. If you ever take a child's gyroscope and you speed it up and then you hold it in your hand, you'll find that it has very strange effects upon its weight and upon your own ability to move your hand relative to gravity, to the force of it. So when you look at those German, what you call flying saucer experiments, that's the direction in which they were going. And lucky for us, as I said, they didn't go any further before Victory in Europe Day came along. But after the war was over, that technology through paperclip basically went to Canada, who got it all wrong and fooled around with something called the Avrocar, which was another joke. And then after Canada washed its hands of it, it came down to the United States in a highly classified project here called Silverbug, which we then tried to move this up towards the jet engine applications of it instead of the counter-rotational ones, which didn't get us very far either, but before it got any further than that, it went deep black. So what you may be seeing today are some developments that extended from those gravitational propulsion and counter-rotational system development projects, which indeed would require circular aircraft.
Right. I was going to ask you, speaking of Nazi Germany, I heard that you, during your time in the military, I think, conducted a Temple of Set ritual at the Wewelsburg Castle, where Himmler's SS used to have their meetings, right? It was sort of their secret, their headquarters, right? Their secret castle. Is that correct? You conducted a ritual there?
Yes, that would have been in 1982. It's generally referred to as the Wewelsburg working. The Wewelsburg is an old castle in near the town of Wewelsburg, which is somewhat close to Paderborn in Westphalia in Germany. And in this case, Heinrich Himmler, who was very much a mystic in the terms of harking back to pre-Christian German Romanticism and the old gods, so to speak, he was also very much a devotee of the Grail myth, as, for example, brought out, illustrated in Wagner's Parsifal opera, which, of course, is a Christianized form of the Grail legend. So Himmler was not only interested through his SS research people in tracking down the origins of the Grail legend, but also he wished to create an actual Grail castle, a setting very much like the mythological castle in Parsifal. And after looking around Germany, he settled upon the Wewelsburg as his Grail castle. So the chambers that he constructed within that castle were actually taken from and inspired by some of the sets in Wagner's Parsifal, constructed by Alfred Roller. Most people don't understand that. They tend to have a sort of a very crude concept of the Wewelsburg as sort of a black magic castle, or just a castle where the SS gathered to think up new ways to create harm to the world. That wasn't it at all. In fact, most of the SS never came near the Wewelsburg. It was a pet project of Heinrich Himmler's, and it was oriented towards the Grail. It would have been very fascinating to see how that all transpired if, in fact, the SS and Himmler had survived the war and he'd been allowed to continue with it. But then I think you would have seen something dramatically different, a little bit, as I said, more towards the exploration of the human soul from a meditative standpoint than the sort of comic book characters that you normally see of it. When I conducted the Wewelsburg working that you were asking about.
Yes, I mean, I just want to know kind of what
Yes.
came of it, or what was the intention, and what did you experience in the process?
Well, the purpose of the working itself, which took place in what's called the Valhalla, or the crypt of the Wewelsburg, which is its lowest chamber in the North Tower there, which is a wonderful magical environment for greater black magical workings, because it's entirely designed to reflect not only sound waves and mind waves in on the practitioner who stands in the center, but to amplify these things. So it was a working, again, to understand and decipher the actual nature of the castle, which had been, until that point, a complete mystery, and talked about, again, in popular literature as just simply a nasty place. So what I learned and realized through that working was the actual nature of it, which was as a manifestation and as an attempt to bring the metaphysical concept of the Grail Castle of legend into a physical form in the material universe so that it could be used as a ritual chamber to enable individuals to engage in that Grail quest within themselves, which is an entirely different, and I thought much more fascinating, concept than what had previously been realized of this. I've worked with several of the people at the Wewelsburg Museum and some curators and historians from Germany who've studied the castle, and we've gone further into this aspect, this concept of it, as opposed to, as I said, what most people consider to be a sort of a black comic book concept of it.
So ultimately, it feels like the ritual aspect of what you espouse, which is the control of not control, but sort of tapping in and recognizing our unconscious mind. That seems to be the essence of the mind war, really, is that people in general are malleable. They're open to influence, and so either they need to either they need to recognize the power of their unconscious brain and start to go deeper in terms of actualizing, realizing their potential themselves, their negative and positive sides both, right? Bringing them into reconciliation. And if they don't do it, we, basically you and people like yourselves in positions of power, are able to, through the mind war doctrine, influence that unconscious brain of the masses.
Well, yes. Now remember that the Mind War book and the program of techniques in it takes place at the objective universe level. In other words, these are the material forces in the universe outside of us. Your body is basically an electromagnetic chemical machine, subject to the electromagnetic spectrum. So this is a sort of a breakdown manual of how that machine functions and how you influence it at that level. We're talking about, as I said, the human body as a machine. Now, within that machine, you have a mind which bridges the physical and the metaphysical. This is the old mind-body question as to whether or not your brain is merely a sort of a supercomputer that's a function of sensory input and expression, which is what the behaviorists and the materialists and the atheists would say, that basically you're just a machine and you react to stimulus and response. Or if you're a metaphysician, as a Setian is, and as a magician is, then the mind is something much higher and much more elegant, you might say, which uses the brain as a vehicle. So in the case of something like the MindWar book, we're not really talking about the metaphysical side of it. We're talking about the mechanical side of it. The MindWar book does get into morality in a very reasonable sense, in a sort of a very objective, very logical, very goal sense, saying, look, you know, we can either treat one another badly and bust up the world, or we can treat one another compassionately and well and create a better world. And indeed, the part of the MindWar doctrine or procedure that's used for that is a conceptual revision of one of the Army's branches, currently civil affairs, which is redesigned as parapolitics, which is a concept developed by one of my old professors and friends, Raghavan Iyer, who incidentally was a theosophist. I studied under him at the University of California in my graduate work there. And he was looking at the time that he wrote his magnum opus Parapolitics to come up with a way of analyzing human political systems to get rid of the junk and to come up with an enlightened, not simply a rational, but an enlightened way of making decisions concerning very real political issues. So the MindWar book takes Dr. Iyer's Parapolitics and institutionalizes it in an extensive redesign of the civil affairs branch, which is what the United States supposedly uses when it goes in to do nation building or reconstruction of things.
Right. Well, it's a lot to think about. Thank you so much for joining us today, Michael. I think we're at the end of this conversation, but I think at some point in the future it would be great to have you on and we can certainly discuss further because there's so many different topics to cover with you. We just don't have the time for now. But I appreciate you coming on and joining us.
It was my great pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Michael.
Bye-bye.
Well, there you have it, folks. A fascinating venture into the question of the war for our minds. And ultimately, the question is, who will become master of it? Will you master your own mind? This is Sean Stone signing off.